what happens here in the United States when you have a 2-degree change in surface temperatures. That's why it was important, because then I could really use that as sort of the foundation for a jumping off point of looking at here's climate change, here's climate change, here's climate change, here's climate change in the United States. And the 2 degrees really makes a gigantic difference in ecosystems. And we're looking now at a 2 to 11 degree change between now and the end of this century. And 2 degrees, I think, we'll be able to manage. If we get up to 11 degrees, game over, as we all know, as you all know. There's a book out that, if you want to get really depressed, I recommend. It's called Tropic of Chaos. I'm sure you've heard of it, by Chris Parenti. And if he's right, you know, we're kind of done for it. But we'll see, you know. And I wrote the book hoping that, you know, it could sort of galvanize people. So that was, I hope that answered your question.
Yep.
Because it forms a foundation. The other piece of this is that, you know, twofold. Number one, you know, I'm a science and medical writer, and I really, really try and be very, very rigorous in my science. And when you're writing about something as controversial as climate change, you've got to be, it's got to be absolutely bulletproof. You know, and obviously you can't be on top of everything, and you're going to make mistakes. We're not scientists, but you really have to do your best. So that's what I felt, that I felt once I had that bit of information, I was on a fairly firm scientific footing talking about climate change here in the United States. So I looked at the United States and I started unpacking, you know, the different elements that would impact on our health. And, you know, I started off just the way we all start off. I talked to all the experts and I sucked up all the background science on it. And, you know, there have been a lot of reports. The public health people are really all over this. You know, they really recognize that climate change is happening, and there have been a lot of reports. And it sort of broke down each of the different areas that are going to impact on our health here in the United States, which is, you know, heat waves, vector-borne diseases, water. The other piece is bad air, increasingly bad air. As you all know, we're dumping almost 32 gigatons of CO2 into the atmosphere every year. And, you know, I always talk about, it's so hard to put your arms around that, but, you know, 1 gigaton is 1 billion tons, which is just approximately twice the weight of every person on the planet. So we're dumping 60 times the weight of every person on the planet into the atmosphere. And as I always say, I tell my husband, what could go wrong? You know, but, and I started looking at, you know, I started immerse myself in all the background studies. You know, what happens when you have all this bad air, and, you know, the carbon domes that form over cities, and the urban heat island effect, you know, the cities are, you know, hotter than surrounding areas. And, you know, I came across a lot of really interesting research that I was able to parse out. But a very interesting thing happened, and I'll share this with you because you'll appreciate this. So, you know, I'm sucking up all the science, and I'm, you know, talking to as many experts as possible. And I talked to one of my primary sources was a fellow by the name of George Luber, who's at the Centers for Disease Control, and he's just a great guy, and, you know, we've become friendly, as you often do with sources. And he's an expert on heat. And I talked to him a lot, and then I set up an interview with a fellow by the name of Dr. Chris Poitier, who was also at the Center for Disease Control. And he had been the lead author on this big kind of compendium study that the CDC had put out that, you know, had looked at all the different aspects of how climate change is going to affect our health. And, you know, I interviewed him, and it was interesting, but I realized he wasn't really telling me anything new. And then I'm talking to George, and George says, oh, yeah, I know you interviewed Chris. I gave him notes for the interview, and I thought, you're done with the experts. Because it hit me that I had really sort of exhausted everything that they pretty much knew, and I had sucked up all the science, and it was time to start doing the gumshoe work of, you know, real journalism, of drilling down. And so in each of the different areas, you know, vector-borne diseases, heat waves, all these different areas, I tried to find stories here in the United States, real people's stories that really illuminates this, because otherwise it's just abstract science and it's really boring. You know, people really don't want to read this stuff. You know, I mean, really, when I was doing this, I mean, I had to come up to speed on a lot of new science, which was challenging, but also, as you well know, fun. It's very satisfying to learn all these new things. And honestly, just sort of stepping back, it really sort of re-energized me as a journalist, because I had really sort of gotten sick of writing about the pharmaceutical industry, because as I mentioned, it was just the same stuff over and over. And now suddenly I'm in a new area, and I'm still very new to environmental writing, but I'm really enjoying it, and I'm starting to do work on a book on environmental degradation, which I got very interested in. So I pulled back and I tried to find stories that would really illuminate each of the things that I was talking about. And I just sort of went through each, I had an introductory chapter that talks about the Dust Bowl and then pulls back and talks about the science behind climate change. And that was something that my editor wanted me to include, because I thought anybody who reads this book already believes in climate change. I have such a hard time with that, to be perfectly honest, because we're talking about physics. It's like, do you believe in gravity? It's sort of insane to me, but in any event, it is what it is. So she insisted that I put in this section on, explaining the background of the science and kind of unpacking that. And then in the introduction, I kind of did an overview of each specific area that I was going to get into. And then each chapter sort of deals with a different element. The first chapter is on vector-borne diseases. And what I looked at with vector-borne diseases was the dengue outbreak in Texas, which was sort of happened, I guess it was the early part of this century it happened. And again, as journalists, I did the basic stuff as journalists. You either find people that it's happening to, or you find, scientists or characters. And, what I focused on was Susan Fisher Hope, who is, one of these legendary epidemiologists. She and her husband have been sort of on the front lines of Ebola and Marburg and all these other things. And, the great irony was that, as sort of a retirement, because, epidemiologists, as you may or may not know, like journalists, they never retire, they just sort of fade away. And, their idea of retirement was moving to, Brownsville and starting another school and starting a campus of public health for the University of Texas. And, she never expected to be in the middle of an outbreak of another kind of exotic disease. So I sort of used her as the spine and a through line on that sort of launched me into this whole idea of the vector-borne diseases. And I wanted to look at other intriguing examples of, vector-borne diseases that we're seeing more of. And one of them was valley fever. And I know that there's been a lot of news about valley fever, in the past 6 months. And frankly, I think it's because my PR people have been trying to spread the story. That happens. That's been sort of interesting.
What's valley fever? Tell us about it.
Yeah, well,
does that have anything to do with California? Or?
Yeah, it does. Yes, it does. And that's been sort of interesting. But I'll get into that in the questions and stuff. And what's happening with valley fever is the environmental belt that's hospitable to valley fever is expanding because of climate change. Valley fever is a fungal type infection that is spread through these fungal sores, and it spreads, in sort of desert areas. Anytime you have construction, it gets spread and it gets sort of aerosolized. I have, someday, every day it's a different word. I have trouble pronouncing. Aerosolized, and it was endemic in Arizona. It's been endemic in the Central Valley of California for at least 100 years. They identified it, and there's one of these great little backstories that, and this just drips with irony. But a lot of the German prisoners of war were kept in the Central Valley, and the Nazis invoked the Geneva Convention because all of their, the prisoners of war were getting valley fever. I will leave it to you to,
Wow.
Which I thought was really,
Awesome.
and to sort of step back a little bit, when you do a book, it's not like a magazine article. When you come across all these little juicy factoids, you can throw them in, which is just really a lot of fun. But in any event, it's a fungal spore, and it's spread in sort of this dry sort of desert area. And as the areas become drier, they're starting to see valley fever in Mojave and places that it wasn't in before. So I looked at that, and I talked to people about that, and I got into all this, background that was really very interesting. And the thing about valley fever is that the Centers for Disease Control, calls it a silent epidemic, and there's 200,000 people a year they think are getting it. So it was all these types of things that I looked into, and kind of illuminating that. And in my research, I stumbled across this fabulous story, and that's the other beauty of a book, is that you get to really sort of dig in and tell all these great stories that you discover. And I came across this guy, Rodolfo Acuña Soto, who is a Mexican epidemiologist. He's at the Mexican National University, and he had done this incredible study. It took him 12 years, and what he showed is that the Aztecs were not killed, as once thought, by smallpox. And, it's controversial, but he had some pretty good evidence on this, and he looked at, tree ring data and things like that. And what he found is that the kind of weather patterns that we're going to see with climate change, and you all are familiar with that, drought followed by torrential rains, awakened this long dead kind of virus. And he really documented very carefully that the Aztecs weren't killed by smallpox, that there had been smallpox outbreaks when the Spanish conquistadors first arrived, but the real die-offs that occurred among the Aztecs, where 17 million people they estimate were killed, happened 30 and 55 years afterwards, which, as an epidemiologist, he said this didn't make any sense, that it would have been smallpox. And he documented that it was some type of hemorrhagic fever. And, I have a whole section in there in this spread of, vector-borne diseases, that the change in climate will awaken a lot of these long, dormant type of diseases. And hantavirus pulmonary syndrome is an example of that, which there was an outbreak in the Four Corners in 1992. And then we had another outbreak last summer in Yosemite, where we had 2 people die. And thousands, I think something like 10,000 campers were exposed to this. And it's the same kind of pattern that, you have this drought that kills off all the predators, and you have the torrential rains, and you have suddenly, this huge growth in the rodent population that spreads these kind of diseases. So that was chapter 1. Then chapter 2...
Really uplifted and thought you'd go on to chapter 2.
What?
I think so you felt really uplifted and decided to go on to
chapter 2. So anyway, but you can see how, I got to break all this stuff down. But, this is just doing a lot of research. But it's fun. Well, I don't know if fun is the right word, but it's very satisfying to really, drill down very deeply. But I was really looking for stories, that would illuminate all this. It's one thing to say that, the changing climate patterns are going to awaken all these dormant diseases. It's another to find stories that really illuminate that kind of thing. Chapter 2 had to do with the bad air, and as you and I talked about, climate change, as you all know, is an environmental justice issue too. And right now, the people that are really suffering the most from bad air are, the poor and disenfranchised, and people of color in the poor communities that are living in areas like near the port in Los Angeles, in the Central Valley, and these are the communities I looked at. And I found this woman, Martha Cota, who is a former social worker in Mexico, and she's one of these people that just, I'm sure you have friends like this. Something happens and they organize, a picket line. And she's one of these people. Her son was getting this really severe asthma. She'd wake up and his, lips were turning blue, his fingernails were turning blue, and she'd rush him to the emergency room. And she was living near the, port. She wasn't rich. And she decided to get to the bottom of why she and all her friends' children were suffering from asthma, and she became part of the USC Children's Health Study. And, it was a long-term study. Her son was enrolled, she was enrolled, and she's since become an environmental activist. And it talks about, how kids who are getting, this incremental exposure over a period of time are they're suffering 20% decrease in lung development, and it's not like, they have this hampered lung development, and then suddenly, they get in a good environment and they can catch up. They can't. developmental windows close. So I sort of looked at that, and the point that I was trying to illuminate there is the fact that the bad air that's accumulating is starting to affect our health in really serious ways. Asthma, and I looked at what's going on in the Central Valley. 1 out of 4 kids in the Central Valley has asthma. And then there's also the spillover effect. 23% of the people in California are college graduates. In the Central Valley, only 12%. So you get the drift. Those who can leave do. And I have, when I was in D.C., I was staying with a friend of mine whose mother lives in Merced. And, she had to get an appointment with a pediatric neurologist. She couldn't find one in the Central Valley. She had to go to San Francisco. So these are sort of the spillover effects, on the health. So that was, the air chapter. For the heat wave chapter, George Luber, became a...
Actually, just hold on one second, because the effects that you were just talking about are sort of more, it sounded to me more like traditional air quality issues, air pollution issues.
Yes.
Which are obviously connected to climate, but
not brought on by climate.
yeah, what was the connection?
Okay, well, the thing is, as we continue to dump more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, you get these carbon canopies that form over cities, and we're going to be seeing more and more of this. And there's a lot of public health data that as, we're dumping more and the temperature goes up, the sunlight cooks these particulate matter so that we create more ozone, so you get this feedback loop. Does that make sense?
Well, the carbon, so tell us about carbon domes, because carbon dioxide is a harmless, colorless, odorless gas. It doesn't have any impact on health per se.
Is it like a heat inversion?
Well, it's like heat inversion, but also it collects over cities. There was Stanford research that talked about how all this carbon was collecting over cities because of the heat effect.
But this isn't necessarily CO2, this could be black carbon, this could be...
It's everything, but we continue to dump this, but then also you have the temperatures that are steadily rising that cooks this particulate matter, and that becomes even more, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
I mean, because one of the points that I brought out in the introduction is that climate change is not the sole reason. In some cases, it's one of the drivers.
Right.
In some cases, it's the match that lights the kindling, or it enhances it, or it accelerates it. So, does that make sense?
On
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, 'cause a lot of this, what you're talking about here, I have concerns about, because, I'm here, my project was to look at how climate change is reshaping the American West, and thank you for letting me in here with that idea, because it's
Huge.
it's not only huge, but it was very naive of me to say, here is climate change, and it is causing this thing, and then I will go find the people who are affected by this thing, and I will talk to the scientists who are studying this thing. And so now, very particular way, we had the flood here.
Mhm.
And so I was like, okay, well, that's a great way to talk about the water cycle, climate change, extreme weather events, and policy and stuff. And then it's suddenly like, well, we don't know if it's actually just a storm, or if it, so this sort of, there are ways to illustrate. So I'm very interested in how you kind of, it's not sidestepping, but you have to really, you have to draw a connection that isn't as ironclad as a scientist would want, or something like that, but you still kind of have to illustrate this danger in your case, or just sort of whatever, it's this mechanism. And so just in my own head, I've been really having a hard time with this storm, because I'm like, well, this is a great opportunity to talk about the hydrocycle and warming air and more water in the air, and then, but you can't draw that connection, so you have to say there's a three-step thing. You're sort of scientists say that the climate change is going to do this to the hydrocycle, and that hydrocycle is going to cause more extreme weather events, and an example of an extreme weather event is this one. So you've made this move that's not, not a direct correlation, but so I'm really interested in how you...
Well,
This is why I'm going to go cover pharmaceutical industry.
It's much more cut and dried, right?
It tastes a lot better too.
Well, Michael, we talked about this.
Yes.
And that's why I sort of unpacked all of this in the introduction, because I agree with you. that's the problem, is that, nobody is doing we're not getting, the scientists aren't getting the funding, because people say, all right, was Katrina caused by climate change? And there was some study that did link it up with climate change, but, to really sort of unpack, all right, Katrina, XYZ happened, and this was due to climate change. These particular drivers, it's very hard to unpack that. But the way I sidestepped it, or the fudge factors, or this, the other thing that I felt comfortable with is that we are going to be seeing more of this as time goes on, and that this is sort of in line, and this is what, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with the floods. I mean, you can't point to the floods and say, well, you know this. You can't point to the floods and say that climate change caused it. Can't point to the floods and say that, we had the mudslides because there were more fires that, burned off the ground, so that, you had the soil erosion and stuff like that. But what you can say is that with climate change, we know we're going to be seeing more of this kind of stuff. So I mean, and I was very clear in setting that up in the
Because
introduction.
besides that this type of thing is
Yeah,
sort
this,
of-
yeah.
But you
yeah.
certainly can attribute parts of that. I mean, there's
You do your
sediment from
best.
the burn scars in the flood. There's, quite clearly aspects of the flood and things that have happened in Four Mile
I think
Canyon.
the problem, though, is you can't say the 4 Mile Canyon fire was caused by climate change.
Yeah, you
And
can't.
that, I mean, it's like fires like that would be increased because of
Right.
climate change, but you can't say it wouldn't have happened without climate change.
Right, that's right.
No, but it's much like, I forget who said it during the conference, pointed out that, it's very similar to covering steroids in baseball. You can't point to any of Sammy Sosa's home runs and say that's because of steroids.
Right.
But you can say he has that record because of steroids.
Right, right.
Or that his record was enhanced by steroids.
Right.
Or,
And I'll
his
also
his likelihood.
just jump in and say that actually now we can say that individual events have been influenced by
Sure.
climate change, but they're done with these really complicated and careful attribution studies.
Right.
And it's, and the word cause is not really in the lexicon. It's sort of, to what degree did climate change, contribute to a particular event?
Sure. I
And
mean,
then they find through these attribution studies
But
that
we
sometimes
we
it
do this all
contributes
the time
and
as
sometimes
in
it
news. I mean,
Well,
yeah,
news,
when
but like
when
when
you
you're talking about just making it like relevant to science also, I mean, there's a lot of, a lot of people would say that's not evident, like, yes, I think Linda's way of phrasing it is great, that this is an example of something we will see much more of, but because you can't say Katrina would not have happened, perhaps it would have happened and not been as strong, perhaps it wouldn't have happened at all, perhaps it would have happened exactly as it was because the Army Corps of Engineers, bunch of idiots, but you just don't know what would have and what would have and what it wouldn't have looked like, and so that's the toughest part, so I think that's a great way to phrase
Well,
it.
you can also set up the
The last thought on that is
probabilities,
the reason that I want to be very careful about this is like one of the main reasons I want to do this project is that there are a lot of people in the American West, where I'm from, that aren't going to just buy into, if I just say like, okay, climate change and like I want to be very careful in saying like, so they're skeptical. I just don't want to preach to the choir in a certain way, and I want to be even-handed, but also true. So it's a really tricky dilemma for me.
And I guess what I want to say is that we don't just anymore have to say that it's something that we expect to see something, more of in the future, because then that's the problem that you were talking about
So we can say
early
in
on.
a not graph
Well, if it's in
somewhere.
the future, then, maybe I don't worry about it. It's just that the connections that you can make are, as you said,
Uh-huh. It's like
complicated, nuanced shades of gray.
Uh-huh.
But there will be an attribution study. It's being done right now on the rainfall event.
Uh-huh.
And they will, at some point,
But they're
come out and say,
pretty tenuous.
say again?
They're pretty tenuous, though. I mean, there's a lot of room to poke holes in those, and so I think
Well, that's what we got.
yeah, I agree, I mean, in terms of science, but when you're trying to communicate to the broader audience, who, a lot of whom might be skeptics, I think presenting those things where it's pretty easy to poke holes in is tougher than to frame it like you have, saying, some of these might directly be caused, but for now, we do know for sure we're gonna see much more of this. I mean, because
There's a couple things, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I was only going to say that it seems that also a good way to get at this is pointing out the not using the extreme events so much as the things that climate change we know are causing that then make a fire worse, for instance, you know,
Right.
whether it's drought or whether it's the migration northward of the, whatever the bark-eating beetle is called, or, you know, that these are the things that we can pretty well attribute to climate change as temperatures are changing or whatever.
Or you can attribute causes and probabilities, and certainly plenty of fires, the probability and the severity of the fire is very strongly attributed to, it can be attributed to climate change, and landscape change, the spread of cheatgrass throughout the West is strongly associated with climate change. The severity of this bark beetle outbreak is strongly associated with the change in climate. I actually have a question, back to your air quality thing.
Yes.
And since we're on fire,
Yes.
and people are used to me talking about this because I've become involved in it. But I'm very curious as to whether you studied at all, when you looked at the air quality issues, whether the pretty strong increase in the number and intensity and size of wildfires, how that has affected air quality and health in any of these communities. Because you point to the fact that some people can move away from areas where you have bad air quality, things like that, but in the case of the Front Range of Colorado, we actually have a lot of people that move here for lifestyle so that they can live in the brown cloud,
Right.
Which is pollution, but we also have, a lot of studies going on at INCAR looking at, how severely smoke is, from wildfires is impacting health, and I'm sure you're aware of what went on in Russia in 2010
Right.
with the
Which I
smoke
wrote about.
Yeah, right.
But
Moscow.
I have to tell you, there was only one study, and I talked about it, but unfortunately, there really aren't, a lot of
I
this.
think they're going on now, but I don't know.
Yeah, but there was,
much
when I
published.
wrote the book, there was only one study, and it was about a peat bog fire
Mhm.
in North Carolina. And, that's sort of an unfair comparison, because those of you who know something about that, peat bog fires aren't really like, the regular wildfires that we see, so I
However,
did.
we're supposed to see a huge increase in those
Right.
with climate
Right,
change.
right, so actually, the studies really haven't been done on that, and believe me, I looked.
Yeah.
I looked, because, I was trying to, because all the questions that you guys are asking, I asked myself, because
Sure.
I knew that, the book was gonna, come under attack, and, if it wasn't, based on really solid science, the little thread was gonna
Yeah.
pick it apart and,
Yeah.
undermine the credibility of, all the work that I did. And one of the things that I was very gratified about is, back to my girlfriend in DC, her mother lives in the Central Valley. She read the book and she said, well, she was very careful with her facts. And, it's not really, it's much worse than she wrote. And I thought, good, that's what I wanted.